Okay, ladies and gentlemen, now we'll move forward to our next event, which is In a New Light, revisiting Dara Shukoh, Sri Chaitanya, and Veer Savarkar. Well, so we have with us Vikram Sampath, Avik Chanda, Chitrita Banerji, and Oindrilla Dutt. Within 1 minute, we are going to start off with our next event. Till then, I request all of you to please be here patiently waiting. First, we have Vikram Sampath. Vikram Sampath is a historian. Vikram Sampath was awarded the Sahitya Academy First Yuva Puraskar in English Literature and the ARSC International Award for Excellence in Historical Research in New York for his book on Gauhar Jan. Next, we have Avik Chanda. With 2 decades of global Big Four consulting experience, he is a business advisor, entrepreneur, trainer, and a speaker at the Outstanding Speakers Bureau. His acclaimed business book, From Command to Empathy, Using EQ in the Age of Disruption, co-authored with Suman, was featured in 2018 in Amazon India's Best Reads. We also have Oindrilla Dutt. Oindrilla Dutt is an entrepreneur, anchor, and moderator. She's the executive director of Open Doors at event management company. In the discussion, we have Chitrita Banerji as well. She's an historian of Indian cuisine. She specializes in Bengali cuisine. She's an author, novelist, and translator. We have 50 minutes for this event, and as the timer starts, we begin with the event.
Hello?
Check. Use this. Good afternoon, everyone. Atre's really scared us already by saying, look at the clock all the time. So today we're going to be looking in a new light at 3 noteworthy figures from the past. 3 figures who are particularly relevant in these troubled times, where we're having to re-examine the old established, long established tenets, fundamentals of nationalism, where pluralism, tolerance, integration, and individual freedom stand shaken and need re-evaluating. We have Dara Shukoh, who Avik Chanda turns a light on here, somebody who was tolerant of other beliefs, somebody who was a perpetual seeker of spiritual enlightenment, an existential being, a worshipper of beauty and the arts, but also a failed military commander and strategist. We have Sri Chaitanya, Chitrita Banerji's written about him, somebody who believed that love was the cornerstone of religion and who changed the way people look at religion in West Bengal. And then, of course, we have Vikram Sampath turning an eye on Veer Savarkar, one of the most maligned, one of the most perhaps misunderstood, we're going to decide today from Vikram tells us, figures in history. Somebody who was the fountainhead of the theory and ideology of Hindutva, which in hands today has perhaps spun out of control. Somebody who at one time also advocated strongly Hindu-Muslim unity, and somebody who was also a writer, a poet, an activist, apart from, this is almost as a postscript, being a really fierce, all his life, critic of Mahatma Gandhi and the Indian National Congress. So let's start this quickly. I'm going to start with Avik. Why did you choose to write about Dara Shukoh? After the business, the poetry, the novel, why Dara Shukoh particularly?
So 2 reasons, really. First is, as you just mentioned, back in 2017, I'd come up with a business book that was published by HarperCollins, and that did sort of reasonably well. And at that juncture, I had 2 options. One is to do the usual thing, follow that up by another business book and say, you know, this is the next big thing. Or to say, I'm going to do nothing of that sort, but to take up, as it were, a passion project. And that's kind of what I wanted to do. And then I said, let me explore really sort of my boundaries and go beyond them. And that's when I turned to history. And so I had an idea that it was going to be about some personage and it was also going to be Mughal history. But you know, even when I just started to do my reading, not in the research, I saw it's like everyone's taken, you know, from Akbar all the way to the last Mughal. And we get glimpses of Dara Shukoh when we are reading about Aurangzeb, when we are reading about Shah Jahan, and of course Jahanara as well. But he's always sort of on the verge of things, you know,
Rather
waiting in the wings.
tantalizing and romanticized
Yes.
glimpses. Yeah, okay. Chitrita, you did hint at this, that from your grandmother, who was a believer in Sri Chaitanya, and what remained with you were two things. One, that message of love and acceptance that played out in your own life when you took a path that maybe people, traditional Hindus, would not have. And the other was Chaitanya's acceptance of other faiths as well. So is that your main reason why you chose Chaitanya? Not on? Yeah, it's on.
Um, it's not that I wrote the book because of my grandmother or because of the way my life, worked out. I came to the idea because of somebody else's suggestions. And then I found, as I was writing and as I was reading about him, that he was a person who lived 500 years ago, what was extraordinarily relevant for our modern times. And this is something that I had never thought about. Here's a man who comes from a Brahmin scholarly family who sort of ditched all of that and did not advocate, rituals and very formal religious practices. And instead, he just decided that personal life or a personal path to God was the most important thing. And I thought that was a particularly, a modern way of looking at religion and looking at faith, which would appeal to people in our times if only they knew about Chaitanya. I feared that a lot of people don't know about him. They don't know much about him. And his tolerance, of course, is to me the most important thing. Not his spirituality, but his tolerance and acceptance of human beings. So I thought that would be a good subject to write about.
Okay. Vikram. Why Veer? And I really don't see him as one going into the other. Was it a personal interest, belief of one of the most dichotomous figures, really, in history? Because he seems to contradict at every turn things that he really propounds and propagates in a nice way. I mean that in a nice way. I'm just referring to something that he said after having said that it's Hinduism and Hindutva all the way. He also talks about, I'm going to quote from that later, humanity, every human being be the same. So why Veer Savarkar? Was it an attempt to rehabilitate him?
Not at all. I mean, if you actually, look at contemporary news, I don't know any other character of the past, particularly of the freedom struggle, who intrudes modern political discourse in the manner that Veer Savarkar does. I think even as we speak, there's some controversy brewing, and there's some news channel that is asking me to appear on their raucous night debates, because there's, we had this whole pamphlet that was brought out in Bhopal last week or so, which also claimed that he had an affair with Godse, and then you had this whole clamor for Bharat Ratna for him in the run-up to the Maharashtra elections. And almost all the time, this man is in public eye. And contemporary politicians, in political rallies, in election speeches, he's invoked. But as an objective historian, when I look back at what is it about him that both his opponents as well as his proponents, interestingly, have to fall back on, I realized that the last biography that was written on him, a comprehensive biography in English, was way back in 1960s when he was still alive, by this man called Dhananjay Keer. Yeah. And ever since then, in the last 6 decades, we've had so many revisions, and that's what history is all about. It's nothing that is set in stone, and every generation needs to look back and re-evaluate characters of the past. Almost every year we have biographies of Nehru and Gandhi and so many others. Bhagat Singh is being re-evaluated. Netaji from here, he's so much a subject of re-evaluation. But it really intrigued me as to why this character, who polarizes opinion so much today, but there is such an amazing lack of intellectual inquisitiveness about him by even those who support him. And most of it is rhetorical, most of it is misinformation, most of it is, as you said, a lot of maligning of him that is done. So for me, characters which are either maligned or which are forgotten, like Gohar Jan from this city, whom I picked up as my muse, these are the ones that really attract me, and I feel it's almost a historian's burden to ensure that all the archival material that is screaming and waiting to be told needs to be brought out to the discerning reader.
Thanks. Tudlu, I want to ask that when you're when you're dealing with Dara Shukoh, here was a man who wanted to engage with different religions. He was really interested in the similarities, the fact that Sufism for him, Vedanta, could coexist, Jewish history, philosophy, Christianity. There's something very interesting in the book by Manucci, who lived in those times, where he says that when Dara Shukoh was dying, was going to die, when he was going to be put to the sword, he kept asking for a Jesuit priest, because possibly Manucci believes he wanted to convert or make a confession. Tell us a bit about all of that. And he was a Qadiri Sufi himself, which is what annoyed Aurangzeb and other mullahs. Yeah.
So when we come to Dara Shukoh's ethos, it was a deeply personal one, and one obviously draws a parallel between that of Akbar's Din-e-Ilahi, Sulh Kul Universal Peace, and that of Dara Shukoh. Whereas Akbar did that not just from a philosophical premise, but also to unite various factions across all denominations, across all faiths. So there was definitely a political motive around that as well. For Dara Shukoh, it was his intense personal search for, as the Islamic word goes, Tawheed, which is union with the divine, with the Almighty. And to that end, I think he was one person who was an eternal searcher or a researcher in common parlance, in modern parlance. So he studied the Book of the Psalms, he studied the books of the Islamic canon, and he perused, with the help of experts, also the books of the
Sorry, I'm just butting in here. He did believe at some point that the Quran refers to the Upanishads.
Yes. Yeah. So two things. One is when he's talking about the similarities, which is one of his main projects in life. The title of his book is called Majma al-Bahrain, and which I think is incredibly relevant today, because when you translate that loosely, it means the mingling of two oceans. So the first ocean is that of Hinduism, which has been there as long as the land's been here, and the second is that of Islam. And the way he saw it in his credo, the two oceans had mingled, there was a confluence of these in this very land. And I think we are very far from realizing that dream yet. So that's the first thing. Second, which at that point of time, and maybe even today in more orthodox circles, would definitely be viewed as being heretical, is there is a surah, there is a verse in the Quran which talks about an ancient book. So sort of predecessor, a prelude to all of the Holy Scriptures. And it is a hidden book. And Dara Shukoh, in his search for that hidden book, finally, he believes, finds it in the Upanishads. And it's a moment of great epiphany for him. And he relates that in his own hand in the introduction, saying, this is the realization that I've had. The Upanishads are the source of all the great scriptures, in particular the Quran. And therefore, he, together with Persian scholars, Arabic scholars, and most notably, a lot of Brahmin pundits whom he had assembled from Benares to his Haveli, to his mansion at Manzil-e-Nigambod, he undertakes this grand project of translating the principal Upanishads from the original Sanskrit into medieval Persian.
Thanks. Chitrita, when you talk about Sri Chaitanya, you mentioned that not much is known about him. Now, he broke through every religious belief of Brahminism in those days. He would go into the house of a lower caste man, eat his food, drink his water. He didn't believe in divisions, he believed in love. For him, religion was about love. And it was centered around Krishna and Radha. So tell us a bit about how he came upon that revelation. Was it just his Krishna Bhakt, his devotion? Did he see a way of life that was better for the world? How? What?
I think Chaitanya himself came from a Vaishnava family, so the worship of Krishna was given in that family and in the community to which that family belonged. Navadvip was already a great center for Vaishnavism at that time. But I think for him, there was a particular epiphany when he traveled to Goa to sort of do the spiritual rites for his departed father. And he saw something which none of his biographies can say what it was, but he had a vision. And that changed him radically. You know, he felt there was a way to connect with God, and that is what he should be preaching to everybody. And in the process of doing that, and this is what I really love about Chaitanya, he had many dimensions that we don't think about these days. But this whole point of, singing, music being an integral part of religion, of being a way to reach God, of poetry. He was a great lover of Vaishnava poetry. Vidyapati, Chandidas, even the earlier poems of Joydev. He loved them. He was a great actor. The Vaishnava community would get together and put on plays based on the stories of Radha and
He'd
Krishna.
seen jatras and learned how to sing and dance.
And he loved to play a role there. He would even dress up as a woman sometimes, and sometimes he did it so well that even his own mother in the audience didn't recognize him. And so I think this very joyful, exuberant aspect of Chaitanya is something that helped him get his message through, even though most of the society was hierarchically still tied to Brahmin orthodoxy. And later on, I think that is what also helped him gather followers when he lived in Puri. He left Bengal and he settled down in Puri near the Jagannath temple. And again, it was this joyfulness, this enjoyment of life, even as you are taking a road to God. This was something that, I think people had not seen before. And one last thing, as a writer of Bengali food, I have been reading about Chaitanya's love of food. And
You keep describing that.
yes, I
Yeah.
keep describing
The
that.
neem begun
The
and the mocha
fantastic
grant.
meals that were made for him. And it's interesting that, his contemporary biographers felt that they needed to describe that. After all, I don't know what happened. I'm getting it from the 16th century
What
manuscripts.
I got out of that is that, again, there's a certain asceticism that goes with Brahminism
Yeah.
that he didn't believe in.
He did not believe in. When he didn't have anything to eat, when he was traveling, he was happy to have just, rice and karela and a bit of ghee if he could get it. When he was with the, devoted followers who had a big house and could invite
He
him
had
and
his
make
repas.
a great meal,
Okay.
he enjoyed that too. He did not feel that you have to be an ascetic in order to find God.
Thank you.
Just as he also, this is to me an important thing, he always stressed the fact that you don't have to be a monk, you don't have to live
Absolutely.
the domestic life in order to find God.
Yeah. Okay, Veer, there's so much to encompass. Sorry.
By the end of the session, my
she's
name
doing
might
that on
just change to
purpose.
Veer, which is not a bad thing, I guess. But then I'm quite Veer.
Okay, there's too much, don't listen to them. There's too much to encompass in this. So I'm going to ask you, I think Vikram gets his own back on me once because he says I sent him to hospital by forcing him to have puchkas on Park Street. Okay, I'm going to ask you quickly about certain aspects. There's too much to cover. That is a fascinating figure of contradiction. Now, this is somebody, Veer Savarkar, Vikram Damodar Savarkar, right? Vinayak Damodar Savarkar.
This is
who was pretty anglicized in that he read literature, he hankered for it, the English authors. He went to England to study law, like Gandhi. He went to Gray's Inn, and somewhere along the way, much later, when he was incarcerated in the cellular jail, he started propagating this idea of Hindi, which should be the national language for everybody, which should, in India, which should, everybody should follow a Devanagari script. How did that transition come about?
Before that, I'll just give a little brief about his, life, about which even it was a revelation for me, because I don't think Savarkar ever features in our CBSE, NCRT textbooks, not even a mention, leave alone a footnote. I was quite amazed to see that this was the man who actually founded India's first organized secret society, which was initially called the Mitra Mela, which later became Abhinav Bharat. And the kind of linkages it had with revolutionaries in Bengal, particularly the Anushilan Samiti and Barin Ghosh, Aurobindo Ghosh, Prafulla Chaki, Khudiram Bose. In the 5 years that Savarkar was in London, the India House that he lived in, that became a hotbed of seditionists, so to say. And such fascinating characters of our freedom struggle, again, whom we have very little information of in our history textbook: Shamji Krishnavarma, Madam Bhikaji Kama, Virendranath Chattopadhyay, Sarojini Naidu's brother, Madan Lal Dhingra, VVS Iyer, MPT Acharya, Sukhsagar Dutt, Lala Hardayal of the Gadar party. All of these people were, choreographing this whole, move for freedom in India through an armed revolution. And Savarkar was actually, also getting bomb manuals printed,
fact,
sent all the way to Calcutta.
That was the first
Dhingra,
time he really came to the forefront,
yes,
really.
yes.
Because
And
he stood up and defended him.
And the British actually feared him as a D category or a dangerous criminal. And at any cost, they wanted to get rid of this man. And so lots of unfair laws were applied on him. The Fugitive and Offenders Act, while he was not a fugitive, he was a bona fide student who had gone there, a very meritorious one, on a scholarship. And he was, sent away back to India. And the maximum, punishment that anybody could be given, which was of 2 life imprisonments, of accounting to 50 long years, to rot in the Kalapani cellular jail in Andamans. And a lot of Bengali revolutionaries who were also there with him. And he was almost like, their leader there. He was called Bada Babu because, he's come from England, he knows the law, he can be our spokesperson. And that's where also the whole, maligned thing about him putting petitions and all that comes into picture, where he was actually acting as a spokesperson for all the other political prisoners and arguing for a collective release under the provisions of the British law that were there at that time. And around this time, he also, I feel this was the time which was a very, significant one in the history of India, where probably the way religion entered politics in a very pernicious manner through the launch of the Khilafat movement that Gandhi launched. Of course, the road to, hell is always paved with the right intentions. So it was with the intention of bringing Hindu-Muslim unity, but then the kind of communal mobilization that was done by the Congress to actually establish a caliphate thousands of kilometers away in Turkey, when people of Turkey themselves did not want that man, and they had Mustafa Kemal Ataturk come here, and we were actually mobilizing a community on religious lines, mobs going on rampage, and there was genocide all over. And in response to that is how Savarkar comes out with this the book called Essentials of Hindutva, where he says what it means to be a Hindu.
Want to come
And this
back
whole,
to that.
and in that context is when he also sees that a lot of the cultural identity of Indians was being subsumed, because even Hindi was being largely written in the Persian Arabic script. So it was to that extent that he wanted a propagation of Hindi, but not at the cost of diversity, because even in the cellular jail, to promote national integration, he brings about prison reforms, after all the tortures that they initially faced, inhuman tortures which, are unimaginable how our ancestors faced in the cellular jail. This man champions prison reforms to an extent where prisoners are actually teaching each other languages. So he says, I will teach you Marathi, Gujarati and other languages, and a Bengali is going to teach you Bengali, and so on. So that there is, through understanding of each other's languages is
I
how...
want to butt in here, just once.
Yes.
What I think he said was that you have to learn Hindi, that's a given, your mother tongue, and one other Indian language.
Which is finally the 3-language formula, I
Yeah.
think, which came up with the government too. But, normally this whole thing is bandied that it is against, it's a homogenization of culture and so on. Throughout his writings, he does say that, you can have as much as cultural, religious, linguistic diversity as you want. But when it comes to a political and constitutional unitariness, I think India needs to have that to remain one nation. that was his view.
Okay. I'm going to come back to you on two things. One, Gandhi, the Khilafat movement, but Gandhi and his relationship. But first, I wanted to ask you, when we talk about Dara Shukoh, he was a dreamer. He was a romanticized figure who was fantastic at opening up to other faiths, other styles of living, other cultures. But he was absolute zilch on the battlefield as an administrator. And the biggest flaw in him that I find in your book that I didn't know about is that he was very, very arrogant. He put off almost every courtier who was senior, almost every person in Shah Jahan's court who could have helped him, taught him. Now, my question is, why is it that Shah Jahan, who was an enlightened monarch, held on to his kingdom, he did whatever he had to do, why was it that he was so short-sighted as to two things? One, be completely negligent in teaching Dara Shukoh what was required on the battlefield. He took him down to the Deccan, kept him away from the front lines. He sent him out when it was safe to do so. In those times, in medieval times, you couldn't do that. That's number one. Number two, tell him that you can't keep rewarding hangers-on when other people have done the job for you. Teach him how to get on with people, diplomacy, which even somebody as disliked as Aurangzeb did. He was a statesman who managed to make the right alliances. So there's a lacuna in Shah Jahan. And secondly, how is it that he also, for no rhyme or reason, he seemed to antagonize Aurangzeb at every turn?
So I think the first question that you asked is, why did Shah Jahan not really tutor his son in the realities of the times? I think the short answer to that, he was just blinded by paternal love. If you look at the history of the Mughals, it's a clash of sons and fathers, really. So you have, and brothers as well. So you have Humayun, who always has to face the ire, the rancor of Kamran Mirza, his brother, who's always at the sidelines waiting to attack him. And thereafter, when Akbar becomes emperor, his own son Salim rebels against him. Salim becomes the emperor. Jahangir, his own son, the crown prince Khurram, then rebels against him, and it's on and on and on, sort of passed on to perpetuity. So I think one of the first things that Shah Jahan, knowing his own past and knowing that of his immediate family, of his ancestors, I think it struck him what here was a person in the being of Dara Shukoh who was gentle, who was warm-hearted, who was generous of spirit. And he actually says this at some point, obedient, dutiful, as a son, as a family man. I mean, the nomadic sort of heritage of Chengiz and Timur weren't, this wasn't exactly high up on their list of things of hierarchy. So that was one. And second is, when you're talking about tutoring, well, no one tutored Akbar. Life tutored him. No one tutored Aurangzeb. He was sent off, which comes to the second part of it, at the age of 16 to the Deccan to wage wars, to learn diplomacy. Yes, but
that was tutoring.
So, but he could have failed. Yeah. I mean, he could have failed in the way that Shuja was essentially a failure.
I think what happens here is that Dara Shukoh wasn't given a chance. If your father shields you to the extent, in the year 1600 and something, I mean in those times, 1500, 1600, doesn't even let you face the enemy, take decisions that could go wrong, that you learn from, you're not cut out to be an emperor in those times.
Yeah, I mean, what's really inexplicable, given that unlike many of the Hindu kingdoms or in much of Christendom, if I have my facts correct, there's a law of progeniture, and which was never in vogue across the Islamic world. And in spite of that, Shah Jahan goes on and conducts a near coronation ceremony and proclaims his son, Dara Shukoh, as the successor, and confers upon him the title of Shahibul Iqbal. It's almost as if he's thinking, by conferring all of these khalats and robes of honor, he can somehow sort of insulate Dara from, the machinations and intrigues of at court.
Thanks.
Which is bizarre, of course.
Chitrita, you mentioned something that's very interesting in Chaitanya's concept. The woman. He was almost seen as a woman. In fact, a big part of the theory around Chaitanya is that a lot of his followers saw him as Radha in his eternal devotion to Krishna. Not that he was a woman, but that was the analogy. So tell us something about that.
I think that was something that did not quite happen in his lifetime. It happened after he had passed away. And it was rooted in the fact that, first of all, he was not just a spiritual guru, but very apparently and very emotionally attached to God. And it was easy to see him as a lover, whether a masculine lover or a feminine lover. But his teachings particularly advocated the selflessness of Radha's love. And that she may sometimes get mad at this guy who's her lover, Krishna, but most of the time she accepts the fact that he is not just for her, that he's got to be shared with the gopis.
With the gopis.
Yeah.
In fact, I just wanted to interject that something very interesting comes out in your book, that it isn't just Radha who gets frantic waiting for him.
Yes.
It's Krishna as well.
Krishna as well.
He's waiting, and how Chaitanya, Sri Chaitanya explains that is
Explains
that as a god, he not only wants to receive, but he wants to
he
give.
wants to give. That was a very important part of his teaching. And I think there he was also kind of inspired by some of the Vaishnava poetry of his time, particularly some of the images of, Radha's going on a tryst and Krishna waiting for her. Those were beautiful poetic passages that he loved. And this is also one of the things that I, as a writer, found interesting, that when he sat together with his disciples, the intimate group of disciples, he was not always lecturing them on faith and bhakti and how to achieve the best way to find God. He also had sessions when his favorite disciple would sit and read from these romantic poems that about Radha and Krishna, and he loved to listen to them, and he would sort of expatiate on the beauty of the images as a sort of symbol of the beauty of human love, which is not really different from the beauty of divine love. And the sort of equation that he made, I think, made it very easy for people, for ordinary people, to think that, okay, we can also find love and we can also find God without being instructed by priests and without having to spend money and without having to go on pilgrimages or do rituals. This is something very simple and very impersonal. So again, I will say, I think Chaitanya is a very modern figure because that is something that resonates with people now. So I found that very interesting, actually.
Vikram. Yes. Okay. I'm going to quote, you've quoted from Janki Bakle, and she's writing about Hindutva. Hindutva is one of the few texts written by an Indian nationalist that links the present Hindu moment of Indian history to the pre-independence anti-colonial period. 5 decades after it was written, it became the Bible of militant and exclusionary Hindu nationalism, taking as its chief enemy the minority Muslim community of India. True, I think. But at the same time, she also mentions that, he employs certain strategies, which I would like you to talk about. And he also talks at a certain point, as I said, this is what he says: after all, there is throughout the world, as far as man is concerned, but a single race, the human race kept alive by one common blood, the human blood. Absolutely contradictory, the two statements, but I have to say that most of what he did and said would seem to preclude the latter and go for the former explanation. My question to you is that in terms of what is happening today, I'm not just talking about India, I'm talking about a world where we have to look forward, where barriers, physical barriers, have to mean less and less, where we were at one time thinking that progress is about knocking down barriers, is about trying to experience from each other the best of our cultures, our traditions, our experiences, our minds, our thoughts. How is it not detrimental to that going forward, to have such a narrow, marginalized view of a people, any people? Because what seems to be the case when you read that is a surprising similarity between whether it's him talking, or it's a Jinnah talking, or anybody else. I've just mentioned two figures that are relevant to us.
That's a very loaded question, and I don't know if I have the time to answer in detail. I'll just try. You see, all these political ideologies, I would say these were product of their times. Like I just explained, the reason for the genesis of the whole philosophy of Hindutva was in the context of the Khilafat movement. And today when we look back, it does seem like a very pernicious wave that was threatening to take over not only the Indian subcontinent, but different parts of India. So there had to be an intellectual response. And you did mention also, about his, feud with Gandhi, with whom he had a lifelong, kind of disagreement intellectually. And later, and it's fine to have these multiple ideas of India. There is no one idea of India, and there are different approaches to what you conceive of a future India, and also what are the various approaches to freedom and so on. But even if you look at some of the other writings, forget Savarkar for a minute, even if you look at what, say, Ambedkar writes at that time, a very important contemporary figure, you just look at his thoughts on Pakistan, or Pakistan and the partition of India. I think Savarkar's so-called Islamophobia pales in comparison, because he's highly more vitriolic, in his assessment of the secessionist tendencies in among a certain section of that community. So I think, and today, but will anybody, given the political clout that Ambedkar has, you just mention this and you'll probably get lynched, but then Savarkar you can malign as much as possible, because he doesn't have...
Not today.
Not really. I mean, as I said, we still had controversies around him as late as last week, where people can do anything from calling him a homosexual to a British collaborator to anything, and nobody really bats an eyelid. So you can do that, but then try doing that with someone else. So I think these philosophies, the political ideologies that you have, I think they're a product of their times, and it evolves with time. Now, it would actually surprise many to also know that Savarkar was never associated with the RSS. His brother was one of the and there were three brothers. The elder brother, one of the founding members of the RSS, along with Hedgewar, Baba Rao, and Savarkar was always with the Hindu Mahasabha, which was a political arm, or a political outfit, so to say, as a counter to political Islam. And you had the younger brother Narayan Rao, who was with the Congress. So three brothers, three ideologies, and they lived under the same house and didn't probably knock each other's head down like they would have now. But then the RSS's view on Hindutva and Savarkar's view on many issues, including on amelioration of caste. Savarkar stood for a complete removal of the caste system, removal of untouchability, intercaste dining, intercaste marriage. He had this Patit Pavan Mandir in Ratnagiri, which was open to people of all castes. And in that same Hindutva treatise, he says we are all of the same blood, the same race. So marrying among ourselves, marrying among, or eating among each other, intercaste dining should not be a problem. And that is one reason. And he also considers, and in today's context, all the more importantly, that the cow is not an animal worthy of worship. It is not, elevating an animal which stands in its own excreta to the level of a goddess is the insult to both mankind as well as divinity. So there were lots of differences in their approach. So I think when we look at historical philosophies or historical characters, that nuance, and also the times in which they said and did what they did, and not extrapolate it retrospectively and then draw conclusions, I think that becomes important. Because was Savarkar's version of Hindutva different from the RSS's version? Was that different from what Godse, decided to take on the gun and do what he did, the heinous crime? I think these distinctions are very important. In his own Hindu Rashtra Darshan that he talks about, speeches as the president of the Hindu Mahasabha, he says, my conception of a free India is one where there is no distinction between people of any caste, religion, community, gender, and everybody is equal in the eyes of the law. And the very words are the minorities need not even have a ghost of suspicion that the state will actually interfere in their religious, cultural, or linguistic rights. But then these need to be in the confines of your home. Please don't bring your religion into the street or into politics. And if just because a community is a majority, they will not get any extra privileges. Just because some community is a minority, they will not get extra concessions. Everybody is equal in the eyes of the law. So how does that become problematic at all? Because then you are actually creating that equality for everybody. So, and he also says repeatedly when the comparison is made between Jinnah and him, in fact, in one of his, he's misquoted by a newspaper and then says, you and Jinnah are similar. He says, me and Jinnah are completely opposite ends of the spectrum because he's asking for extra concessions, whereas I'm asking for equality for all. I do not believe that you can have a nation within a nation. But I do believe that there are two nations as long as there is one section in a larger community which talks not of nationalism but extraterritorial allegiance to a universal brotherhood or ummah. And as long as that exists, there is going to be secession, there is going to be these tendencies, and a lot of it does prove right in times to come.
I'm going to come back to you. I just want to touch on some of the things that he writes about in his thing, which need to be talked about really. As you said, most of what was negative, and I definitely see a propagation of a division on grounds of religion, which definitely is there in his writing as negative. But what we don't talk about, what we should talk about, are the facts that he attacked Brahmanism, an old Vedantic view of Hinduism, where he talked about the fact that intercaste marriage was frowned upon, shouldn't be. When people sailed across the seas, you became an untouchable. That shouldn't be. You ate together, that was frowned upon, shouldn't be. He also propagated reconversion of Hindus who had been converted to Islam or Christianity or whatever, which was an interesting departure from Hinduism. One believes that one is born a Hindu, can't be converted. And a lot of things that he said there were
quite radical and far
but
beyond his time.
Would definitely be beneficial. And I don't think there is anybody who would doubt that. And again, a lot that he said, which is almost completely inexplicable in today's context of universal brotherhood, which is on paper. But I'm going to ask you something. Tudlu, in today's world, we are talking about Dara Shukoh, who is an inept general who lost all the wars that he was in, who couldn't win, who couldn't be a diplomat. He wasn't. That is the least, because his arrogance was an intellectual arrogance. He was impatient because he wanted there to be universal brotherhood. And people in the court couldn't understand that because they had the close confines of their mind, which only understood an orthodox Islamic religious practice. What I wanted to ask you is, Arun Shourie says this is the man we need today, given the context of the current troubled times. Do you think somebody like him would have made a difference today?
Oh, absolutely, totally. Unlike the medieval times where it was important to not just be a warlord, but be a very successful military commander in person, in the field of battle, that is no longer a consideration. But to have an ethos which is all-inclusive, which is embracing of all kinds of diversity, is absolutely the need of the hour. And if you're talking about lack of humility, well, take Donald Trump. He isn't exactly the paragon of humility, and he's doing all right with his constituency. So from that standpoint, intellectual arrogance wouldn't have come in the way of an administration which is more inclusive, which is more embracing of diversity in today's times. And given what we have, I think it's not enough to say Dara Shukoh was the emblem of Indianness, which is something that came up very recently in one of the symposiums in New Delhi, as recently as September last year. I think it's very important that we live by the principles of his ethos.
Thanks. Thanks so much. Okay, Chitrita, I'm just going to go to the end, Chaitanya's end, very briefly. Very interesting, because there's a lot of conjecture about that. Did he had frequent fits of crying, laughing, rolling on the floor. It was almost like he was an unbalanced person sometimes. And did he walk into the sea? Because he's been known to do that, and his followers have pulled back on one full moon night. Was he killed? That's a theory that you say is unlikely. Was he killed by the temple priests who were jealous of his influence with the king and with other followers? I mean, is there any plausible pointer towards what happened to him?
I think the plausible pointer is something that one of his disciples wrote about, which is that during the final Ratha Jatra festival, when he was out dancing along with the procession, his foot was injured by a sharp stone. And he, of course, paid no attention to it. And after the festival, nobody noticed that, the cut was, getting infected and swelling up. But eventually, it brought him down with fever. And I think in modern terms, we would say that he developed sepsis, and that is what killed him. But there is no record of what happened to his body. In none of the contemporary documentaries, documents, there is any mention of we buried him in such and such a place, or we put him in the ocean, and there is no monument to him in Puri anywhere at all.
And I think an interesting sidelight is I've been to the place where he stayed in Puri.
Yeah.
And seen his columns, they were like this size.
Yes, huge.
So he must have been a
He
giant
was,
of a man.
They do describe him like that. He was a giant among men, and so he was very noticeable from a distance when he was out there dancing and singing and chanting. He was also a very handsome man, and I repeatedly, quoted from various people the descriptions of him. Yeah. And I think, that sort of, adds to the fact that he was, he drew people so much to him. Partly, a little bit of it was also because of his charm and his good looks, and not just his spirituality or his love for people. Okay.
I just want to give a little sidelight about Gandhi that Vikram has written about, and Veer Savarkar. The first time they meet at India House, Veer is cooking prawns. And he tells Gandhiji, will you eat with us? And he says, of course not. He's horrified. And he says, if you can't eat with us, how can you work with us? And the next time,
he also says, this is just boiled fish. If you cannot, and we want young men who can bite the British alive. So how do you plan to, work with us as a revolutionary?
Also to Tracy, the last bit about the Khilafat movement, I think a lot of people, Veer's followers had a lot of reason on their side, because almost all of India ultimately wondered where we were going with supporting a movement that was, in essence, trying to propagate a lack of democracy, where Kemal Ataturk wanted the Ottoman Sultan out. What were we doing as an Indian nation who wanted democracy, not supporting that? So I'm just going to ask you to end very briefly before we take two questions. Just a couple of sentences. Why do you think Savarkar should be relevant today?
The very reason that, as I mentioned right at the start, that he's invoked all the time in contemporary political discourse, in election rallies by politicians today, and the fact that the philosophy that he started off as a very umbrella kind of a philosophy, inclusive in many ways, but which has metamorphosed today, but it does have political currency, the way India has moved politically. I think that makes it all the more important to reevaluate a person who started this whole thing off and understand what was the motivations behind that, rather than go with preconceived ideas or misinformation, which is what has been rampant when it comes to Savarkar.
Thanks. I'm going to leave this discussion per se on the thought that I wonder if it's going to work ever in a democracy if every government dispensation has different icons, has different principles to follow. And I'm going to quote from Vikram's foreword to this book, where he mentions that Veer Savarkar was the kind of iconoclast who said himself that if you find me relevant certain years on or hence, please just confine my books and thoughts to the dustbin. Okay. We're going to have a couple of questions. Yes. Could we have a mic for the gentleman, please? Quick questions, please, and only questions. No, just tell us. We'll repeat it. We'll repeat it. What's your question? Yes. Vikram Sampath. We can give him another mic, perhaps? Why did Savarkar conspire to kill Gandhi? Well, that doesn't come through in the book at all. I will let Vikram answer this short.
Yes. I mean, that's part of the volume 2 of my book, and I'll ensure that Apeejay invites me again to talk about it in detail, but it would suffice to say that, actually there was a trial that was conducted, the Gandhi murder trial, which among all the people who were accused, Savarkar was the only one who was acquitted because there was no evidence against him.
Yeah.
It was something the way he was, you could call it a fixed kind of a conspiracy. And if you actually look at Godse's dying declaration, which was published, it was banned by the Congress government and published almost 20 years later, where he says, why I killed Gandhi. He himself says, towards the later end of his life, Savarkar had become very pacifist, and we actually got disillusioned with him, and we broke away from him. We decided that he and the older Turk of the Hindu Mahasabha would not be good enough to fight our cause, and so we broke away from him, and he had no knowledge of the conspiracy. Now, he was anyway going to be hanged. There was no reason why he should actually save some other man. So the assassin's dying declaration, and also the fact that he was acquitted by court, and you had a government which didn't like him so much, if they had those evidences against him, they could have gone in for appeal, which they didn't. So I think at some point we must start respecting the judiciary, not only when it gives a judgment in our favor, but even when it looks at all the evidence and passes a man as and can't keep hanging that albatross on a person 70 years later too.
Okay.
Okay, Vikram, I have a very short question. This book ends in 1924, but as you just given a hint that you are writing the second part of that, I just want to know, immediately in 1950s, immediately after the independence, when there was a clear conflict between Golwalkar and Savarkar, for which Golwalkar pushed Shama Prasad Mukherjee to create a new political party, this particular part of history is very badly explored. Nobody wants to talk about this, including BJP leaders. I just want to know, are you prepared enough to expose this part of history in your coming book?
She kept calling me Veer for not without any reason, and I do think I am going to do that as well with whatever I have.
Please do that. We want to know the conflict between RSS and Savarkar.
Much to my own peril, I am going to do that.
Okay,
Please
we're just
rest
going to
assured.
have one last question from there. Saira, do you have a question?
It is to Mr. Vikram Sampath. Actually, as students in schools, we didn't read much about Savarkar. I don't think there was any mention over there. So when you are re-evaluating, rather I say you are evaluating. He was never evaluated. So how much you will advocate for including his history in the history books, Savarkar's life and his thoughts?
I think it's very important to have different voices because history is not monochromatic.
It is.
And particularly when it comes to our freedom struggle, I think 2 generations have been indoctrinated with this fact that there's just one simple, linear, monochromatic narrative of how we won our freedom, the non-violent method, which was, of course, the mainstay and which probably, galvanized the masses. But then right from 1857, the first war of independence, till the 1946 naval mutiny, which was held by Netaji in Bombay, there was an uninterrupted chain of a violent armed struggle as well. And if you look at the various milestones of Indian history where the British actually gave concessions, Morley-Minto reforms, Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, the Government of India Act, and finally freedom, it was largely many times in response to these violent outbursts and revolutionary movement. And that history has never been told to our people because we've always been fed this spiel. And revolutionaries are usually shown as these hot-blooded young men who throw bombs here and there and then they get executed and so on. But evaluation of that is not done. So I think now after 70 years, we need to have this very unemotional assessment, as you said rightly, evaluation of what actually got us freedom. 1942 was when we had quit India. Why did it take 5 years then for the British to actually leave India? Was there the naval mutiny, which is what shook the empire, on whom the sun never sets? And in this very city, I think Clement Attlee, when he had come here, he did acknowledge that it was Netaji and the INA which actually got Britain to leave India. So I think all of this needs to be told today with a very dispassionate, apolitical, and I do hope politicians and political parties exit the sphere of history and leave it to historians, writers, and academicians to actually do that so that we can have that unbiased view of history.
Thank you. Everyone in a new light looked at 3 people in history who could have made a difference, whichever way, in today's world. Thank you so much for being here for this session in the 11th AKLF. You're going to...
Thank you so much. Can we have a big round of applause for Vikram, Sampath, Avik, Chanda, Chitrita Banerji, and Oindrilla Dutt. Well, so for the book signing, you can catch them at the bookstore just nearby the bookstall. So the book signing will take place just to my right at the bookstore.